Valve obviously realised the popularity of Team Fortress 2 and has continually tried to improve and expand the game through various updates. Making a good game better is a good prospect, but it's just as easy to make it worse whilst endeavouring to improve things by making poor or rushed decisions. I think TF2 is a good example of this phenomenon, and it has over 10 years of continual updates to analyse. The first major update came in April 2008. This introduced the payload game mode and the first class update, which was the medic. The payload game mode was a great addition and is still now one of the more popular game types. The medic update introduced 3 new weapons, which were generally well received and gave some new playstyle options to the medic. However, despite the positive feedback, the singular class update set a worrying precedent. The new medic weapons were unlocked by completing enough achievements to hit certain milestones, which meant players were going around playing specifically to complete the achievements rather than doing their best to help their team. A singular class update also meant everyone wanted to play as the new class to enjoy the newest features of the game, which ended up creating teams stacked with a single class in a game where a good mix of roles is required for your team to do well. This single class update system continued, with the Pyro getting a second treatment in June of that year. Valve stuck with the achievement system for unlocking items, which led to more teams piled up with a single class, most of whom were more interested in hitting the achievement milestones than actually playing the objective. This trend continued with most class updates, which created another problem. The game launched with 9 classes, each with 3 weapons. This provided a good amount of variety whilst maintaining the game's balance. With more and more weapons being added, it made it more and more difficult to keep all the weapons in line. A number of the weapons came out overpowered right from the offset. The Backburner originally gave its user an extra 50 HP just for holding it. Natasha was infamous for how much it slowed down its targets, and the Sandman, I would argue, was considered one of the most overpowered items released in the game's history. It was able to stun ubercharged players. They were fixed in a stationary position while stunned, and had no damage reduction whilst they were stunned as well, meaning a scout who hit you was generally able to finish you off with 2 shots before you could react, unless you were surrounded by your teammates. Valve had, and still has to this day, a knack of releasing items and then hurriedly nerfing them once the backlash becomes too big to ignore. Go on the TF2 wiki and look at just how many buffs, nerfs and sometimes complete reworks of items took place. Even after having come back to the game for around a year ago, a large number of items had stat changes and sometimes complete reworks. Valve released a number of class-specific items in smaller themed updates, making an original set of 28 weapons number well over 100. Later, in 2009, Valve added the crafting system, which, for the record, was before the game went free-to-play or had the in-game store, both of which I will talk about later on. The system allows you to craft specific or random items based on the unwanted ones you had in your inventory. It's a nice idea to get rid of the unwanted weapons to craft new ones, but it takes so many pieces of unwanted gear to gain a random class weapon, and even more to get a specific one. If you wanted to try a new weapon, often your only choices were to try and craft it, trade it, or hope you were lucky enough to get the weapon you needed in a random item drop. Item drops were introduced as a way of players obtaining items at random intervals during the playtime. This created the infamous idling situation. For a period of time it wasn't uncommon to have several players on your team sitting AFK in spawn, simply there to gain the item drops that would drop in their inventory every so often. Valve eventually fixed the issue, but it's another example of poor planning and execution. 2010 came around, and with it came the Manconomy update. This was the first time you could pay real money for in-game weapons and cosmetic items. Again, note this was before the game went free to play, which I'm still coming on to. This wasn't inherently a problem with the game, as all the things you could buy with real money you could also craft using random drops. However, crafting items and weapons often took up a lot of resources, and these resources need to be gathered by scrapping weapons you may have wanted to use later down the line, and the chances of getting a specific item you wanted in a random loot drop was unlikely. The biggest issue with this update were the item sets. Certain items came as part of a set involving a primary, secondary, melee weapon and a hat. If you had all 4 parts of a set, you would receive a unique stat change. Hats took a huge amount of resources to craft, even compared to weapons, but players who wanted an edge could jump into the store and simply buy anything they were missing to complete a set. Some of these sets gave you unique buffs that had no downsides. Let's take a look at the Scout's Milkman item set for an example. The 3 weapons are reasonably easy to obtain, but the hat is much harder to get hold of, and is required to complete that set. A player who is lucky enough or rich enough to be able to get the hat to complete the set would receive a health buff just for doing so. Having unique buffs for these item sets, and then making cosmetic items that were required to complete said item sets very difficult to obtain without real money, was a ridiculous decision that Valve later rectified, but it's another example of poor planning with its updates. 2011, and Valve announces that the game is going free to play. This was an understandable decision. The game was a few years old, and making the game free to play makes financial sense. The item store made sense for free to play players, and they could still obtain weapons through crafting. But the older crowd were less happy about having to fork out money or craft the newer weapons now the game was free to play for everyone else. Buffs to item sets were still in place at this point. For example, according to the TF2 wiki, the Milkman's health buff wasn't removed until 2013. A notable portion of the community felt that the game they enjoyed was fast becoming an item simulator, with players in the games filling up the chat with trade requests or spending time at spawn trading with other players instead of helping their team. 2016, and the release of the update that caused more community backlash than any other, the infamous Meet Your Match update. Before this update, there were two ways of joining a game: Quick Play or the server browser. The server browser listed both community and official Valve servers. Valve servers are 24 players, had standard respawn times and standard game rules, and were pretty much lag free if you picked a server that was in your region. Community servers offered players some different experiences, with custom game types, trading servers, and servers run by specific clans. With the server browser, you could find any server you liked and joined it, stay as long as you wanted, unless of course somebody kicked you, and then leave whenever you wanted as well. Quick Play was a quick way to jump into a game where you could select a game type, whether or not you wanted to join a community or Valve server, and the game would find an appropriate server and place you in it. Meet Your Match changed the system completely. This update removed Valve servers from the server browser, removed the much loved Quick Play option, and replaced it with a casual and competitive matchmaking system. If you use casual, you selected from a list of possible game modes you were willing to play, and could filter maps if you wanted, and instead of being placed into a server, the game placed you in a waiting list, and when there are enough people waiting to play a game that fit a certain criteria, the game would place all of you into a match, or it would place you in a game with a free slot if there was one available. When this new update launched, it was a disaster. With no way to directly join Valve servers anymore, and with Quick Play removed, you had to use a new matchmaking system. With casual, people were sitting in a list for ages trying to find a game. Even if you were placed into a game, it was often with only one or two other people until the algorithm realised it needed more players to make the match work. The game introduced a levelling system, presumably to match people with opponents of a similar level of experience, but everyone was defaulted to level 1, regardless of how many hours they had, their win rate, kill-death ratio, etc. Game balance seems to be, for me at least, a consistent issue to this day. It's often more common than not for the match to end in a steamroll for either one side or the other. I don't know how the matchmaking algorithm works, but it feels like whatever it's doing is rarely creating balanced games. You will often find yourself placed into games where both teams are only half full, because half the players left when the previous round ended. When a match ends, players have 3 map options to choose for the next game, but normally at least half the players leave when the match ends, and the game won't find enough people in time to refill the slots on the vacated players. The end of a round in most cases signals that you need to go back to the menu and restart matchmaking. This was now the only way most people could play TF2. You no longer had the option of joining whatever Valve server you wanted and playing for as long as you wanted until you felt like quitting or changing to a different server. Community servers were still available in the server browser, but it's very difficult to find one that runs anything resembling a standard game mode. There's also competitive mode, which for transparency I admit I haven't actually played, but it's not too difficult to research this particular mode. Everyone started at rank 1, but there seemed to be glitches in the ranking system which made it very difficult for people to level up. There's footage of players online winning games and coming top of their team, and then for some reason de-ranking. Players that did make it to the higher ranks found it more and more difficult to find games, and didn't want to sit around a competitive matchmaking queue waiting for a game just to be able to play. Competitive mode has been considered near dead if not outright dead for some time, and the general recommendation is that the people use third-party competitive systems that were already in use before Valve officially supported competitive play. The most striking aspect of this update is just how unnecessary it was. In the previous examples I've talked about, it was generally Valve trying to add new features and ideas to the game to make it more interesting and fresh, but they were just poorly implemented. But the Meet Your Match update just seems to have no purpose. People were already happy with the quick play in the server browser, and having the option of Valve servers and community servers in the same browser. Implementing the matchmaking system would have been fine as an alternative option to this, but changing the way everyone joined servers so dramatically with a new system that didn't, and arguably still doesn't, function properly is a nonsensical move. Why replace a system that serves its purpose perfectly well? I know I've talked a lot about the negatives of Valve's updates, but I haven't created this video just to lay into Valve's decision making processes. To their credit, there have been some good updates and additions to the game despite the issues they've had. The greatest successes are probably the new maps, many of which are community made. The new game modes are good as well. Payload was introduced some time ago, but its cousin Payload Race is also quite fun. Man vs Machine was introduced as an interesting cooperative alternative to the main game. The benefit of the new game modes is they don't interfere with your game if you don't want to play them. The new weapons and the way they were released created some balance issues, but they are mostly fun and provide alternative ways to play your favourite classes. Valve should be credited for consistently updating the game with new features, but it's a great case study in making a game worse by trying to improve it. Valve has made consistent missteps with its updates whilst trying to improve the game. If you have something that works, and works well, you don't always need to change it, because you don't want to affect the reason why it was so popular to begin with. A lot of people have made the claim that Overwatch has killed TF2. Overwatch hasn't killed TF2, but if they don't start learning from their mistakes, Valve might just kill it themselves.